This conference will now be recorded.
All right, thank you to everybody who has joined the call so far. Thank you for joining us today. Before we start our webinar, I just wanted to welcome everyone. For those that are new to the Young Professionals community of interest, a couple things to take note, which are also on the slide. We do have our monthly calls, and anyone and everybody is welcome to join in on our calls, to sit in and listen to hear of the things that are happening within our community of interest. We also have an active LinkedIn group and Facebook page where we also post some of our events as well. Next slide, Eddie. I also wanted to call attention to our conferences. So the next one that the young professionals will be attending, though virtually, is JETC, which runs May 17th through 21st. The website is listed if you want more information, but I did want to call your attention to some of the events that the Young Professional COI is putting together to help engage our members. So a couple of these are still TBD in terms of date and exact, some of the details, but follow the website, go onto our LinkedIn page. As we kind of solidify details, you'll find more information on our pages. But the first one is a good one if you're new to just the community of interest. If you're new to SAME, the first one's a good event to get involved in, but it's just a way to get to network and get to know people before JETC starts. So yeah, I would look into that. And so again, as we get more details, be on the lookout for that and to get involved. I will say the Young Professionals community of interest is pretty engaged, and so we've got a lot of things happening. So please join us if you can. Okay. I will, Eddie, next slide, please. I will actually turn it over to our guest speakers so they can introduce ourselves. But as a reminder, if you have questions, please type them into the chat box. I will moderate that, and as questions come up, I will bring them up. But yeah, just type them into the box. Again.
Phil, I think it's over to you.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Senior Master Sergeant Philip McAlpin, currently here at Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado. And before I begin with my introduction, no, my official photo was not shot at Glamour Shots. That was just perfect timing and lighting, and they did an awesome job in public affairs, making me look a lot more respectable than I actually am. So with that, I joined the Air Force in 2001. Since then, I've enjoyed a plethora of experiences that the Air Force has provided me, to include 7 deployments to the CENTCOM AOR in Iraq, Afghanistan, and most recently in Syria. Had a lot of great experiences and lessons learned from those environments, and I am very appreciative thus far of my time in the Air Force, and hoping to make it another 10 years within my career. Have a diverse background within the military. I was a member of the Airborne Red Horse team for roughly 15 years. Got to go to a lot of cool HUA schools with our joint engineer partners, Army Airborne, Air Assault, Pathfinder, got certified as a contingency airfield pavement evaluator down at Tyndall Air Force Base. And then while I was working at Fort Benning as an airborne and jump master instructor, I got selected to assist the Defense Battle Lab with some theory and doctrine development, which was very eye-opening at the strategic level. Most recently, just prior to my arrival at Buckley Air Force Base, I was selected and attended the United States Army Sergeant Major's Academy. It was a one-year course down at Fort Bliss, Texas. I graduated with a bachelor's in leadership. In 2019, I was selected as one of 12 Outstanding Airmen of the Year. If you're not familiar with the program, the Air Force as a whole, total force, active guard and reserve components, select 12 members. And I was fortunate enough to have some awesome opportunities within that year and worked with some incredible airmen and guardians to that assisted me in propelling to that next level in recognition, which I am incredibly grateful for. Currently, I'm in the Society of American Military Engineers Leadership Development Program. I believe that we have 2 months left in there. And for those that are interested, I highly encourage you apply and participate. It has been incredible experience, a lot of great dialogue and experience from different perspectives and walks of life within the engineer enterprise. And I am very fortunate to and blessed to be a part of that program as well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our next guest speaker, Captain Brian Mayer, who is currently a Guardian, and he will introduce his background. So over to you, sir. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Senior. All right, good morning. I'm Captain Brian Maher, one of the other guest speakers. As Senior McAlpin had mentioned, I am actually a Guardian in the Space Force. My current job is a Denver Mission Director at the Aerospace Data Facility, Colorado, within the National Reconnaissance Office. So the intelligence community is essentially the community that I'm a part of right now. That includes, in my facility, NSA and NGA, as well as the NRO. So I had joined the Air Force in October 2012 through the Officer Training School in Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Had been in for about 8 years at that point before I transferred over to the Space Force in September 2020. Some of the experience that I had prior to going to the NRO was military satellite communications experience out at Schriever Air Force Base, also here in Colorado, but that's down in Colorado Springs. I was a member of the 3rd Space Operations Squadron, which actually stood down in 2016 or 2017, then was stood back up as a new squadron with a different mission just last year. I also have some standardization and evaluation experience. So for the MIL-SATCOM system that I was operating, I was the individual who would essentially bless new operators to be able to go onto the operations floor and command and control the satellites that would be operated. And then right before I went to the NRO, I was stationed at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, where I was part of the 533rd Training Squadron, which my roles and responsibilities at that unit were essentially to build all of the curriculum for all new ascensions into the Space Force, what we would call undergraduate space training next. It was the next iteration of a long line of courses designed to provide our new operators, our new space professionals, with the knowledge and experience they need to, so they can step onto the floor once they got to their home units and be impactful members of those units right from the start. What was different about that was prior to 2019, we had only taught at the unclassified level, which you can understand from a space perspective is extremely challenging. You can get a lot of the basics done, but preparing people, our new space professionals, to actually fight tomorrow's fight without classified information is very difficult. they're already behind the power curve compared to their peers when they arrived at their home stations. So we wanted to correct that, and the new course actually has at least 50%, if not more, of the curriculum is classified information up to the top secret special compartmentalized level. Prior to the military, I had worked 10 years in the civilian sector in a variety of different jobs. There aren't many jobs I haven't really done, so I guess you can call me a jack of all trades at this point. But yeah, I also have a master's degree in space studies from the University of North Dakota. I got that in 2017 to complement my environmental science degree that I got in 2003. A lot of people would ask, environmental science, how does that work with space? There's a lot of transition, or there's a lot of overlap in those two career fields, especially in the intelligence community when you start looking at satellite imagery, right? From a perspective of like commercial imagery, like digital globe and stuff like that, which I did in environmental sciences quite extensively. So I have a lot of experience with geographic information systems, extrapolating information out of satellite imagery and then running statistical analysis to try and analyze what the trends that I'm seeing are. But yeah, there's a lot going on in the Space Force at this time. As you know, we're relatively new. If we can go to the next slide, please. All right, there you go. So transition into what is the Space Force? What are we doing? Space Force was created in December 20th of 2019. There's really a need for a specific separate force in order to address some of the national security concerns that we had within the space domain. Our adversaries have been performing some pretty provocative actions in space that have gone largely unseen by the general public for decades at this point. And we had seen some even more troubling trends within the last 5 to 6 years that we really needed to address and make sure that we had all our ducks in a row. And being under the Air Force and Air Force Space Command, it was kind of a challenge in terms of competing for money. So that there was not only a national security perspective that we needed to address, but there was also a funding issue that we needed to address and make sure that that training pipeline of individuals that were coming from ROTC, from OTS, and from the academy, we were getting sufficient numbers of individuals to man all of our units. So there's a bureaucratic political aspect to it as well, but that pales in comparison to the national security threats that we needed to address. So the Space Force is led by General John W. Raymond. He is the Chief of Space Operations. He is now considered one of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or of the equivalent. So he has direct access to the President to advocate for the space community at this time. So his job as the CSO is to organize, train, and equip space forces to address those national security issues that I stated in terms of adversary actions in space, but then also to make sure that we provide the space capabilities not only to our forces, but to allied forces. We're kind of the link that brings all the joint forces together in terms of the support functions that we provide. Currently, there are 16,000 Space Force personnel assigned to Space Force. That number is going to grow to about 20K. One thing to keep in mind is that the majority of individuals that are actually assigned to the Space Force are civilians and contractors. The military personnel is a small percentage. When I say small percentage, last I saw an estimate was about 2,500 to 3,000 military personnel out of that 16,000. That number of military personnel will grow as the number of units that we need grow to address the different mission areas that we haven't developed a squadron for yet. The bulk majority of all the transfers to the Space Force, to include myself, came from Air Force Space Command. That includes military, civilian, and contractors. At this point, the U.S. Space Force leverages greater than 75% of all the enabling functions. So your force support, your civil engineering, your logistics, those functions from the actual Air Force. A lot of the personnelists on most of the Space Force bases will be United States Air Force personnel. They won't be Space Force personnel. Right now, our Space Force personnel are assigned to address the mission of the Space Force, not all the support aspects. And I know there's a question about how many actual Space Force bases are there currently. Right now, we only have 2. Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in Florida and Patrick Space Force Base in Florida as well. Those are the main launch locations that we have for launching our satellites into space. There'll probably be more that transition later, but I suspect if any Air Force bases transition to Space Force bases, it's going to be based off of what percentage of the mission at that base is devoted solely to Space Force missions. Okay, next slide, please. The next slide just shows you kind of the way that we're organized. We did a massive reorganization of our force to reflect the different mission types we have. So in the Air Force, you have a wing, a group, followed by squadrons. We got rid of essentially the group level. So right now we have the equivalent of a wing and squadrons, right? Well, wings being garrisons, and then your delta commands, which just reflect the different mission types that we perform. So if you want to learn more about that, that slide should wrap that up pretty well. And then the other graphics we have on the slide are most of the organizations that we interact with on a daily basis, and also the entities that we provide Space Force bodies to, in order to help them understand what are Space Force requirements and how we can help them and support those agencies in terms of increasing their effectiveness and getting a mutual beneficial symbiotic relationship with each other, so we can make our overall joint and coalition warfighting more effective. And so I want to go back to that comment where I said most of the enabling functions will be performed by the Air Force. A large portion of that is going to be the civil engineering portion of it. We need a lot of ground infrastructure in order to support our actual command and control operations. So what I mean by ground infrastructure is, we need antennas that to send signals back and forth between the satellite and the ground. We need a complex assortment of ground systems that enable all of our different interactive functions that enable the command and control functions to work. You have to think about power. You have to think about alternate fuel sources, our roadways, base security, and just anything under the sun that doesn't have to do with actually performing the command and control mission. So the protect and defend capabilities. So with that, I think this is a good segue to bring in Senior McAlpin into it and talk a little bit more about the infrastructure portion of how civil engineers can really support the space.
Hey, thank you again, sir. Appreciate the support and feedback on the Space Force standing up. It's an incredibly exciting time. And with that segue and that transition, in this slide, I just want to kind of highlight some of the relationship status and also some of the conflicting requirements that we've been experiencing here. You can imagine with the stand up of any new service and new mission sets, new mission capabilities, you try to identify exactly what the priorities are, why they're priorities, and internalize what priorities are important right now and why. So with that being said, as we transitioned into the supported roles within the Space Force and the Air Force from the engineer entity, we have a little bit of feedback?
I can't tell who it is. If
You
you're
could
not
mute
speaking,
your phone or device. If not speaking, I appreciate it. I think someone's on an engineering site.
sorry, I'm trying to mute them one at a time. I can't tell whose line it
No
is.
worries. It says caller 13 keeps coming up.
There it is. Okay, I got it.
Yes, sir. So imagine, if you will, you had a new service stand up, but you were operating under the previous organizational structure and construct to identify the priorities. You can imagine that some of the traditional requirements and priorities that you were operating under, say, for instance, the United States Air Force, but when you stood up the new service, obviously they have priorities, they have punch items that they want to knock out very quickly. It can start to create some friction and confusion, but it's important to understand those relationships within the supporting and supported roles. And that's where we find ourselves right now, to where, you know, with the NDAA coming up, and then the posture statements from each respective service, I'm kind of interested to see where, as Captain Mayer said earlier, where that funding is going to go in the political and bureaucratic sense, and how we're going to define which priorities are important right now to either meet our threats that are near peer or peer adversaries may be presenting, and also how do we take the infrastructure we're currently operating under to support long-term goals and mission sets that we're trying to achieve in the next 3 to 5 years. One of the huge issues that we're trying to understand is in our investment strategy. So you can imagine from the allocation execution, that could potentially take years. So what we're trying to understand is what can we apply in preventative maintenance right now to our current footprint to meet the needs today, and also reprioritize our corrective emergency work to keep the infrastructure we have now to meet the needs and requirements for our new service. So some of those are definitely somewhat tricky, because from a traditional engineer, you can imagine, you know, HVAC systems are, you know, very important across the base, but when it comes to Space Force, you can imagine that they are not important. They're actually vital to keeping systems cooled and meeting some of those mission requirements that keep their mission going day in and day out. And when it comes from the allocation execution time frame, some of those HVAC systems that are state of the art now, but in that 3 to 5 years, by the time we get it funded, get them installed, they could potentially be obsolete. And within those, you know, those threats that are ever evolving and changing, you have to stay on top of that power curve in order to get the appropriate level of support to not increase vulnerabilities in support of that infrastructure, if that makes sense. If you can go ahead and go to the next slide. And this one is essentially another huge aspect to some of the challenges we're experiencing here at our current location regarding manpower. So hiring the force that we need. Currently, it's like, hey, what do these applicants need currently to be effective with the area and environment they're going to be operating within? A lot of the areas that they're going to be operating in are restricted, And with that comes specific specialized training and security clearances to ensure that the environment that they are operating in is not being creating more vulnerabilities to support that infrastructure. So you can imagine within the Denver area, we have an incredible base of talent, but it's also how do we compete with the Denver metropolis area, and especially the contractors that could be having salaries of $100,000 to $150,000+ a year, and we're trying to attract them onto base, but we can only offer them essentially GS 12 to 15 position and retain them. From what I've seen, we have a good amount of contractors that are willing to support the infrastructure within those restricted areas, but they're normally only for that year or two, and then they start seeking other opportunities, but outside in the civilian sector. So that's been kind of a difficult process, and we have to navigate some retention efforts to keep our best and brightest within our side of the spectrum. Another item I've kind of experienced here during my tenure is understanding the geographically separated units and what those locations need currently, and forecasting them out in those 3 to 5 year increments, and understanding, like I said, the supported and supporting roles on who controls and who's going to be fighting and allocating for those funds to broaden that footprint to the infrastructure that those locations need, and also the personal manpower to support and maintain and sustain the infrastructure to make sure that mission keeps going. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic we find ourselves in, but also we're finding it, we're starting to get those resources in now with identifying several locations, getting the right talent management personnel there, and then also securing those funds to ensure that we're also getting the resources we need to execute when it's needed. So on that note, I would like to offer it up to any potential questions you have for me from an engineering perspective. I did have one question that came out before regarding Huntsville and who's essentially controlling the construction and construction management in that site. It's going to take some years. I believe the execution is for fiscal year 2023 or 2024, but I do know that the U.S. Space Force and their staff, the S4 and S7, have stood up an acquisition command to understand and address the requirements that are going to be needed out there at Huntsville, and we should start to see some of that funding going out for solicitation within the very near future. Any other questions in there? I'll try my best, but that's still kind of the gray areas that we're trying to navigate with those supporting and supported roles. So on that note, if you can go over to the next slide. We'd like to provide an opportunity to the members to ask any questions at this time regarding either Space Force or some of the engineering challenges we've noticed. And I'll turn it over to the audience. Thank you for y'all's time.
So I see a couple, questions are coming in. So let me start. Let's see. Their first question, what facilities does the Space Force currently use or project that they will need in the next 5 years?
I could talk from a Space Force perspective on that a little bit. In terms of facilities that we utilize within the Space Force, we have a quite diverse array of facilities that we use. I'll just talk about some of the main bases that we're located at. So I already mentioned we have Cape Canaveral Space Force Station and Patrick Space Force Base. Those are launch facilities. The other launch facility that we have is Vandenberg Air Force Base out in the central coast of California. That does most of our sun synchronous or polar orbit insertions. We have a large contingency of Space Force personnel out there. That includes not only launch facilities, but training facilities. We actually have the Combined Space Operations Center that's out there, as well as the SPOC, the Space Operations Command. And then from there, in Colorado is the major base of, I would say, our infrastructure in terms of base-wise. Out here we have Buckley Air Force Base, which is where myself and Senior McAlpin are currently stationed. On Buckley, we have an NRO facility that a lot of Space Force personnel and Air Force personnel work at, to include other joint mission partners. We have the 2nd Space Warning Squadron. I'm sure you've seen them in the news recently about they provided early warning to Al-Assad Air Force Base when Iran launched an array of ballistic missiles at them about a year ago. So, as well as other support functions on Buckley. But then we also have Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, which right now is the current headquarters of what we would consider Space Force, even though we have an administration aspect of it in the Pentagon as well. But at Peterson, we also have our electronic warfare mission based there. So when you talk about our counter communication system is located at Peterson. And then at Schriever, we have the bulk of our mission sets, especially from an orbital warfare perspective. So we have GPS operations, which is at Schriever. We have all of our MIL-SATCOM operations at Schriever. We have some other experimental squadrons that are there, as well as the new 3rd Space Operations Squadron that has a different mission set. And then we have people distributed at different bases across the country as well, where we have a handful of individuals supporting other different mission sets within the overall Department of Defense. I mean, the list gets quite long. I mean, pretty much anywhere there is a Air Force base, generally you find at least one.
Yeah, and I'd like to highlight too that you can imagine that if you have a traditional airman engineer entity that, you know, for decades has been trying to push, hey, the airfield, the hangar systems, maintainer support systems are all critical and vital to the Air Force projecting air power and meeting the needs of the Department of the Air Force. Now it's kind of like, hey, what is important now to the United States Space Force, and how do we connect those dots and prioritize internally under the Department of the Air Force to ensure both mission sets and capabilities are able to meet the ever-changing threats that are being presented by our adversaries. So right now it's very interesting, especially from a career airman engineer, to see and be involved in some of the discussions like on why HVAC, electrical and utility systems are so vital to the space component to ensure that we keep their missions going, because there's a lot of potential vulnerabilities there that in essence we've maybe overlooked, but now we're absolutely prioritizing and making strides in correcting, so that way we can meet the needs of not only the United States Space Force, but the Air Force as a whole. And it's incredible to see now the collaboration on how important both perspectives are, which is interesting to not only see and hear currently in my position.
see. I'm going to combine a couple questions here, but what current job opportunities exist for civilians, not just for civil engineers, but maybe for mechanical and aerospace engineers?
Sir, would you like me to start with this one?
Yeah, you can start with that. I can talk about aerospace engineers and mechanical engineers and industrial engineers from the Space Force perspective.
I mean, just in a sense, from the engineering perspective, I'm just going to highlight some of the positions that we've identified here. There's a plethora of them within the Buckley community. And like I said, trying to get that talent management and retain them has been a challenge, but we're doing a very good job in advertising. One thing that I constantly read is the development of hypersonic delivery systems. I could see that having overarching lines of effort in not only just the Space Force in general, but also how we address war and to meet the needs of the future fight. So you can imagine, instead of having to posture equipment and war-ready material in certain areas within certain theaters, maybe being able to launch logistical support in a hypersonic delivery system and getting them within minutes, maybe even hours, rather than taking months, if not years, to develop those relationships and infrastructure to support them and maintain them in those theaters. So I find that incredibly interesting. And also just working within the civil engineering community, addressing some of those vulnerabilities I said within utilities, because we've been operating under infrastructure since probably I would say the 80s, and bringing them up to speed to meet those vulnerabilities that we're seeing today is vital. So those are some of the opportunities with what I'm seeing. On that note, I'll turn it over to Captain Mayer to kind of give the Space Force perspective.
Yeah, so within the Space Force, you have a couple of career specialty fields that comprise the bulk majority of our personnel. First and foremost, there's 13 Sierras, which is what I am, is what you would consider your basic Space Force operator from an officer perspective. I'll talk a lot to the officer perspective because most of the engineers that are coming into the Space Force are going to be officers because they have bachelor's or master's degrees in some sort of engineering field. Generally, the engineering fields that we see from individuals in the Air Force that are 6Xs generally are electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, aerospace engineers, and sometimes industrial engineers. We need those types of backgrounds in order to fill some more high-level shops. And what I mean by shops is like anomaly resolution managers. We need individuals that are familiar with basic design and construct of satellites, so they can backtrack some of the telemetry that they're getting. Telemetry just meaning the health of the satellite. You have certain components on the satellite that send a signal down indicating, hey, I'm within tolerances, or I'm in a really bad state. I need someone to take a look at me. So that's what engineers are doing. Once they see something that is in a bad state, they'll backtrack it and try and figure out, well, what was the cause of this? Is this environmental? Is it structural? Or does it have something to do with the wiring of the spacecraft that's causing us all these issues? But then also you need those engineer types heavily involved in acquisition process in order to inform the acquisitions and the contracts as to what requirements we need for a particular mission set. So certain satellites need to be able to perform a certain function that provides us with some sort of situational awareness or a different type of capability. And we need individuals that are well versed in engineering in order to inform that process going forward. but we also need individuals that are very familiar with ground systems and ground architectures, like how you link the antennas into the command and control center, and what do the pathways look like. Lots of electrical, lots of actually you need computer software engineers in order to maintain that.
And I like to highlight too the second and third term effects with the standing up of the United States Space Force has had on the industry and some of our partners. You can imagine everyone's taken a valued interest in companies such as Raytheon, Northrop, Boeing. So engineering as a whole, they're trying to understand like, hey, what part of the picture do we have to support making it a successful transition and stand up of the United States Space Force. Just, you know, how they're restructuring themselves in order to support is actually pretty eye-opening. And I've Googled quite a bit on Indeed and Northrop and engineering opportunities. They're all restructuring themselves in order to better support the defense industry, which is pretty awesome to see. It's about seeing what not only we need currently in today's state and addressing those vulnerabilities, but hey, forecasting out, how do we meet the needs of those mission sets, again, 3 to 5 years from now?
Next question. Does the GPS satellite constellation now fall under Space Command for management?
Yeah, so the 2nd Space Operations Squadron actually commands and controls the GPS satellite constellation out of Schriever Air Force Base. When the Space Force was stood up, that GPS squadron, 2 SOPs, did transfer over to the Space Force. So yes, it would be in Space Force for management.
Oh, thanks, baby. Oh, it smells delicious.
Okay. Let's see. Next question is, how is the environmental impact of increasing space activity being assessed? And internal Space Force division, or is the responsibility being sourced to EPA?
So there's two ways that you can address that question. You can talk about the environmental impact within the space domain itself, and you can also talk about the environmental impact terrestrially. And the terrestrial portion of it would be more on the terms of being addressed from Senior McAlpin and from the civil engineering portion of it, but I can take the space domain portion of it. There are certain provisions within the Outer Space Treaty that address environmental impact. We have to be good stewards of the space environment. So that means, like, when we launch satellites into space, we have to be cognizant of the debris that we create when different sections of the rocket body separate. And mitigation efforts have been very effective in reducing the amount of debris that we produce. Now, unfortunately, when you have a satellite in space, accidents happen. Satellites have accidents, and sometimes they break apart. And then it's our responsibility to track that and make sure that we have an accurate accounting of each piece of debris's location and velocity to determine whether it's going to be a threat to other satellites in space. Because the last thing we want to do is create more junk in space than absolutely necessary. So we have that environmental responsibility to keep in mind. And there are actually United Nations provisions or agreements in place that also work with all spacefaring nations to be able to reduce the amount of debris in space. So cleanup efforts in space, that's still ongoing. That's quite a challenge to try to address it. But as responsible stewards, when a satellite meets its end of life, meaning it's either out of fuel or the solar arrays can no longer provide enough power to power the satellite, we will do what we call a super sync. we will push the satellite into a much higher orbit, so it's no longer in the way of operational satellites. That could be anywhere from 100 kilometers above its current position to 1,000 kilometers of orbital altitude above its current position. The idea is just to get it out of the way so it's not a threat to anything else, and we're putting it into an orbit that's not very useful and shouldn't affect our ability to transit through the space in and around the Earth. And I'll hand that over for the ground perspective from environmental impacts to Senior McAlpin.
To be honest, it's kind of business as usual. We're doing our utmost to make sure we're not making any, impacts currently or even after the life cycle of any infrastructure being placed. I would have to reach out to our engineering flight and department to get a definitive answer for you. But I do know it is something we absolutely from the ground up take very seriously, and we engage with the EPA quite often to make sure we're not making any environmental impacts that have long-term effects.
Next question, does Space Force interact with NASA on potential future manned space platforms to include training Guardians for spaceflight?
So there's a long history of cooperation between the Air Force Space Command and NASA. There were several programs back in the late 60s, early 70s that were solely U.S. Air Force sponsored manned missions, meaning manned space stations. That relationship still exists today, not so much in manned stations, but providing personnel to NASA so they can train them to be astronauts. I see a lot of fighter pilots transition to become astronauts because they need pilots to pilot the shuttle or any future types of manned spacecraft. But that goes beyond just providing personnel to NASA. We also work closely with NASA in terms of personnel recovery actions. So every time astronauts are launched into space, there's an active monitoring that needs to go on in order to protect them in space. Because we talked about the debris earlier. That's a major threat to the International Space Station, where we have NASA astronauts and also astronauts from other countries that inhabit the space station. But once they leave the space station, they have to re-enter into orbit. And any number of things could go wrong during that re-entry. So we have to have teams on alert to be able to recover them no matter where they land. And part of that is you have certain cells out at the Combined Space Operations Center and then also at Air Space Force headquarters, where individuals or a group of individuals work closely with NASA to coordinate those recovery operations. So that's another aspect of it. Now, I saw a question on there about potential Space Force presence in a lunar outpost. That's more of a NASA initiative at this point. There are no Space Force plans to put Space Force personnel on the moon, or at least publicly. I would imagine if there's going to be Space Force personnel presence on the moon, it will be as a NASA astronaut on loan from the Space Force. And there's been all kinds of different papers and articles written about why Space Force should get involved in starting manned outposts on the moon and the Mars. And there's all kinds of good reasons for why we should or shouldn't do it. But that's kind of the state where we're at today. So other than outside of a NASA presence, I'd say Space Force personnel manning stations on any other bodies, I'd say is deep.
I volunteer weekly to pay tribute and do some crater repair on the moon, preferably the dark side, but that's just me.
Yeah, you and every other Space Force person.
Okay, let's see. what are the current and future needs for the Space Force with regards to surveying, mapping, or geospatial needs to accommodate the civil infrastructure development of the force?
Well, that's all you, Senior.
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, what are the current and future needs for the Space Force with regards to surveying, mapping, or geospatial needs to accommodate the civil infrastructure development of the force?
Well, I would say from my experience right now is that we are constantly surveying to see what the footprint looks like currently and what it needs to be in the next 5 years in order to support infrastructure and bringing it up to the standard we need currently. So I wouldn't say it's really any different, but there has been more of an emphasis on space utilization and how we're addressing certain vulnerabilities, I'll say, to support the Space Force. So a lot of projects going up to, I guess, I'm not going to say I guess, but in order to support the infrastructure and the needs and requirements to make sure that the uptime and the standards are met if in the event that we are hit with any particular threat. Does that make sense? Sir, is there any way to elaborate on that? I don't want to go in any unclass portion.
Yeah, I think I have an idea of how to answer this. You can do the current state to improve infrastructure or to do surveys for new sites for construction projects using the surveying, mapping, and geospatial techniques that the question addresses. Or you can look at what's the future needs. And what I mean by future needs is kind of goes along with the lunar outpost is if you want to develop a lunar outpost, where do you determine where the most likely site would be to build that outpost? And you would need to do those surveying, mapping, and geospatial activities before you actually designated a site and began construction. What that surveying, mapping, and geospatial will look like will involve satellites going in orbit around the moon and just taking imagery in a variety of different techniques. You'll need panchromatic black and white images, but then just to get the general terrain, you'll need some sort of spectrometry to determine, well, what does the substrate consist of? What material does it consist of, and how deep does it go? Because ultimately, if you talk about a lunar outpost, you're going to want to be somewhere close to a source or a deposit of water ice, because that can provide you with shielding against radiation for the habitation modules. That can water ice can be split into hydrogen and oxygen for rocket fuel, which could expand your ability to explore deeper into the solar system. But then also it could be used for drinking water. But you won't know that unless you do some of that surveying, mapping, and geospatial activity to really determine what it is, what the lunar landscape looks like, and can that area in particular support construction for the facilities that we need. But you could say the same thing for terrestrial infrastructure projects current state. I would imagine this goes back to the Huntsville question as well, is, we have to do an assessment of, are the current facilities at Huntsville sufficient for Space Command, or do we need to construct new facilities to accommodate the Space Command? And if so, then that's going to involve an environmental impact study. What are the consequences of the construction? What are the environmental impacts of it? And does the current landscape support that construction? Does it have the right substrate? Because if it's a sandy soil, then you're going to have some construction issues. I mean, it can be overcome, but it's going to be a little bit more challenging and more expensive. So just things like that.
Great, thank you. Given that we only have a few minutes left in the hour, and if it's okay with our guest speakers, I can get the rest of these questions over to you, and maybe at your earliest convenience, if you could provide responses to them, then we can send them out to those who attended this webinar today.
Yeah, you can forward those questions to both of us, and we'd be more than happy.
Absolutely, and I would be more than happy to get with our subject matter experts from our varying flights and to get their perspective as well. So please fire away and send them over.
Yeah, sounds good. So for everyone who's on the call still, if you've got follow-up questions or if you have any particular questions you want answered, please send them over. But again, thank you both for presenting to us today and sharing your insights. It was a great webinar. So yeah, thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity. Looking forward to continuing assisting the Society of American Military Engineers to the utmost, my utmost ability. And just if you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, thanks for having me on here. It's not very often I get to do presentations like this, so anytime I get to interact with different communities is always very rewarding. So if you need another Space Force body to do another presentation, keep me in mind.
Thanks, y'all.